we'll record the second half. Okay. So the next thing we want to talk about is we think about the structure of ecosystems, is biogeochemical cycles. And so this is really looking at sort of the underbelly of our ecosystem. So as we've been thinking about how these different ecosystems exist, what plants are there, what animals are there, temperature and precipitation play a big role, and of course our major chemicals play a role. Let's go. Okay. So we're going to talk about what are the cycles that we care about. We're gonna slim down. There are many we could talk about, and I'm going to generalize. And while I understand that water isn't necessarily a single chemical, we're going to kind of pool that together instead of doing oxygen. So we're going to look at water, carbon, nitrogen, which covers a lot of bases. There's a lot of forms of nitrogen that are important. I'm going to lump it all as one. And same thing with phosphorus. There's a lot of forms of phosphorus that are really important. I'm going to lump that all as one. We're going to spend a little bit of time on nitrogen as phosphorus, as those are kind of the major plant nutrients in their bioavailable forms that would trigger sort of plant, bacteria, and fungi growth. And if we have time, depending on how the speed's working, we'll look at a case study. Okay, so we're going to spend some time going back and forth in a couple of units looking at what are called trophic connections, which is kind of a bigger word that just means kind of food chain. But in the end here, what this comes down to, and we're thinking about biogeochemical cycles, right, or biochemical cycles, is that when it comes to food, we know that solar energy is kind of infinite or abundant. With the exception of when plants are shading each other, the sun doesn't sort of become limited in any way. Okay, the sun comes out every single day and always gives us more. But the chemical elements in a given area are limited. Okay, when you drain the soil of a certain element, say nitrogen, then there's no more nitrogen there for right now. Okay, when you eat all of the chips in a bag, right, then those chips are gone, and you have to go somewhere else to get more chips. Okay, and that's what this comes down to. And so life on Earth depends on the movement and recycling of these essential chemicals. And so the stock for something needs to be replaced continually. That's very Lion King kind of aspect, the circle of life. And that's the whole point, is when something dies or when the food processing of a given thing occurs, this is important because it's basically replacing that bag of chips. Okay, something needs to go back into the system. So now there is nitrogen again, or there is carbon again. Otherwise, we would take everything out of the system, and then it would leave the system. Okay, right? It doesn't poof disappear. We need to keep in mind our transference of matter, but we're moving it around. It's constantly being moved around and out of that specific system. Right? You eat the bag of chips, then you never buy more bags of chips, which we can all agree is tragic. Okay, so there are lots of different ways in which this occurs. We think very strict and straightforward, the circle of life sort of business. Okay, when an organism passes on, okay, all of the energy, okay, so then all of the nutrients, okay, and compounds in that organism's tissue, okay, can be broken down and then recycled into the system. Okay, so we're going to transform the tissues, okay, and recycle them back into the system so that they can be reused. Okay, it's sort of like taking your leftover turkey, okay, and remaking it into like a casserole. And we're going to reuse it. Okay, so we can break down those atoms and molecules into something more simple. This is usually done by a variety of decomposers, usually bacteria or fungi. Okay, so very specific specialists that do this. Okay, these molecules can be returned to many different places. We normally think of it just getting dropped down into the soil or the water, depending on where our organism has passed away. Okay, so it's just getting drained in. But even from there, they can get spread apart and moved around. Okay? We also need to remember this stuff gets put back into the atmosphere. If you can smell a decaying organism, things are being recycled into the air as well. Okay, that's often a sulfur or nitrogenous compound, and those compounds are then being released to the air as well. And that's also important. Okay, so we talked about and touched on cycles a little bit in class on Friday, particularly when we were talking about the carbon cycle, right? And we talked a little bit about greenhouse gases. But when we're talking about nutrient cycles, just like everything in ecology so far, right? These have both a living and non-living component. Okay, so we have most of this being living components. Okay, living organisms are consuming, moving these things around, or decomposing them. Okay, but at its core, okay, the nutrients themselves are of course non-living. Okay, they're inorganic or organic food products, right? They're just chemicals. Okay, and so as we remember that the components themselves are non-living, and most of the time they're inert. Okay, they're sitting in soil, they're sitting in water. Nitrogen in its most abundant form is sitting in the atmosphere, right? It's N2. Those are all abiotic or non-living pieces. And so the pool for these guys tends to be abiotic. So you need both. Okay, so we're going to look at some light roots. Okay, and I'm going to try to be specific on which ones, particularly as we're still trying to trim down a little bit here at the beginning to make up for lost time. For the pathways that I care about when we're learning about which ones of these matter most to the organisms that we're going to be paying attention to in class. Okay, and there's a lot of different routes or pathways to get from fundamentally being inert, okay, or inaccessible to ecosystems and organisms, okay, to being part of the food chain and then being cycled back out again. Okay? And this can become a little overwhelming because the way this happens can be very dependent on the element itself. Is it nitrogen? Is it carbon? Is it phosphorus? As well as the structure of the food chain itself, right? Is this tropical? Is this aquatic, right? Are there people involved? So we're going to really narrow our scheme, focus on what's most common, and selfishly a little bit what's most interesting for what we're going to talk about, because we cannot feasibly cover all of it. Okay, so there are a handful of categories that we're going to focus on. I'm going to focus very lightly on this global category. And so I've already sort of mentioned this. So for example, these tend to be the gaseous forms. So in our heads, we can kind of picture this. We can picture, for example, oxygen in this form, right? Okay. I already mentioned that nitrogen takes this form when it's biologically unavailable at 70% of our atmosphere. Every time lightning hits, it brings some nitrogen down with us and makes it biologically available. A lot of our biogeochemical cycles have some phase where they're just hanging out in the atmosphere. Okay. We talked about on, I think, Friday, the carbon one. Okay, about how nearly every natural carbon cycle kicks it up into the atmosphere where it hangs out there for a while, and then it comes back down and becomes part of the aquatic cycle or the plant cycle or whatever. It often goes up with rain, comes back, or goes up into the atmosphere as evaporation and comes back down as rain. Okay, oxygen is often the same way. A variety of different pieces. That actually does come back down with rain, right? H2O, those bits come back down. Okay, the parts that we care about in a very specific and individual way are what are called local. Okay? These are going to be the non-gaseous forms. In other words, the active or biologically available form. Okay, they still might be cycled. Okay, the plant uptook nitrate, which is a form of nitrogen. Okay, the plant was eaten by the rabbit. Okay, the rabbit died. Okay, its body is decomposed. That nitrogen returns to the ground. Right, so that's still a cycle. Everybody see that? Okay, but there's not a part of that cycle where it's returning to the atmosphere. So we're not receding back to that global stage. Okay. As a result, these are called heavy or non-gaseous forms. Okay. So most of the things that we tend to imagine as nutrients fit into this. So phosphorus and all of our metals that for the most part we're not going to talk about as well fit in here. Minerals and metals. Okay. Calcium, of course, doesn't have a gaseous form at all. You know, your ions and oxides and all those don't have gaseous forms at all, which also means that when we think about these minerals and stuff, that they're much harder to move. Calcium, magnesium, you have animals that may travel large distances in order to get at them, right? So if you imagine something like a salt lick or calcium lick, some animals actually will travel long distances or cross really dangerous rivers to get their mineral inputs. Okay, there's a lot of famous antelope and zebra crossings that involve crossing like horrific crocodile rivers, but it's one of the only places you can get magnesium and calcium in large amounts by eating the clay on the other side of the river. Okay? That's because these particular compounds, right, don't have that atmospheric cycle, so it's a lot harder to move them long distances. So you have to go to them, right? They're not coming to you. Okay, any questions about any of that? Okay, so we've got a couple minutes left, so we're going to go ahead and start the first of the 4 cycles that I want to sort of lightly focus on. Okay, water. Okay, and I know this sort of isn't a classic chemical per se, but I think we can agree from an ecosystem perspective that the cycling of water is core to ecosystem function. Okay, so all organisms need water, right? So much to the point that historical scientists thought that organisms were made of water to the point of sort of misunderstanding how organisms function, right? So this is sort of basic key elements. Now we do know that this affects ecosystems at a really key piece, right? The more water you have, the more primary production. Okay, so this is referring to basically plant or algae. Sort of hate on our algae sometimes. Algae does more primary production than most plants, as well as mosses, etc. Okay, so this is growth from our plant kingdom. It also affects decomposition. So if you've ever seen those scenes from the desert where it looks like there's just dead skeleton trees hanging out in the desert, okay? This is because deserts are too dry to actually decompose dead bodies very well. And so trees can actually die and not decompose, which is why it looks like their skeletal bodies are still standing, and that's because there are. There's nothing that can decompose a huge xylem and phloem body in that dry of a desert. And it's not like scavengers are going to come out and eat the bark in the same way that animal bodies get taken care of in a desert. So water really matters to decomposition. Okay. Now, while Earth by and large does have a lot of water, accessibility of water is a huge issue. And this is something we actually know as humans. One, the vast majority of the water is fundamentally useless, right? It's salt water, which very few organisms can use, okay? Unless you are a saltwater organism, so fishes and dolphins. crabs. Fresh water, okay, is rare and it's sort of pooled in very specific locations. Much of it frozen, and we kind of want it to stay that way as is, right? Okay. But it's also capped in these frozen places. And so we really only have 1% in lakes and rivers, so accessible to humans as much as it is anything else. Bears, raccoons, okay, what have you. And very little of it in the atmosphere being cycled at any given time. Okay. So this is one of those sort of chronic issues, okay, that other organisms struggle with just as much as we do. Okay. There isn't a lot of water to go around, and it seems like it's always in somewhere else, right, than where we are. Okay. And then on top of that, humans are making a concerted effort to move it around on them. Okay, so this is probably fairly intuitive. Okay, we've been learning sort of the processes of water since we was little. Okay, so very simply, okay, you've got the water in the cloud, floofy. Okay, water comes down as precipitation, dust rain. Okay, the solar energy does most of the return. Okay, that's evap. And that isn't just from the ocean. Of course, we get that off of grasses, we get that off of rivers, we get that off of lakes. Okay. When it's in the air or when it's in a high area, sometimes off of mountains as well, that's when you get condensation. That's why you get clouds forming over like high mountains and things. Or you get that cluster. Okay, so those are the main cycle bits. Okay, don't forget, within plants as well, you get movement. Okay, basically transpiration, which is the movement of water up a plant, and then you'll get it flowing up and out of the leaves. It's basically evapotranspiration. Okay, doesn't matter as much when it's happening from a blade of grass. Okay, but when large trees are doing it, you can move a lot of water. Particularly, you can kind of suck it out of the ground and move it into the atmosphere. Okay. I'm going to stop on key processes so you guys don't feel like you need to scramble through the next slide. All right, so we'll pick up with cycling and water on Wednesday. Don't forget that we'll meet straight at Ellis Pond. So if you guys need something before then, I have a break between 12 and 2 where I'll probably be loading my car, but you guys will be able to get a hold of me if you need something, okay?